Hello scholars, and welcome to our third video on Wuthering Heights. Today we're going to be talking about chapters 11 through 14, and just to dive right in, the first thing I want to point out, again, if you're using this edition, I'm on page 108 is the beginning of chapter 11, and I just want to start by saying how Nellie, for all of her faults, is able to think back on Hindley and feel sorry for him. So on the bottom of 108, she says, or she thinks, poor Hindley, she exclaims actually. And I just think that's really important, that she is one of those characters who is reminding us to have some sympathy perhaps for Hindley, even though at this point he is a terrible father and an alcoholic and a gambler and all these things, that she still has some feelings and some sympathy for him. When she sees Hareton on the top of the very next page, and remember, this was a child that she was responsible for. She nursed when his mother died and she took care of him. And when she sees him, she says, my first idea on observing an elf-locked, let me say that phrase again, elf-locked, elf, like a non-human fairy kind of creature, brown-eyed boy. It's interesting that, you know, other than Heathcliff, he's the only other character that's mentioned as having darker features, setting his ruddy countenance against the bars. Further reflection suggested that this must be Hareton, my Hareton, not altered greatly since I left him 10 months since. So, two things to point out: how the non-human description of an elf is used with Hareton, the darker features just like Heathcliff too. So even though they are not blood related in any way, I think Bronte is definitely making a point, and it's something that we should follow closely as the readers to see the similarities in their descriptions. He also learns from Heathcliff to call his father Devil Daddy. And on the bottom of 109, I know I have at least one student who's tracking every time there's a non-human or like a monster devil description with Heathcliff. And here it's interesting that Hareton is using this to describe his father, but it's said by Hareton, who learns it from Heathcliff. So do with that what you will, but the expression is Devil Daddy. If you are then continuing to track, you know, those kinds of words with Heathcliff, on the bottom of 111, God forbid that he should try, answered the black villain. I detested him just then. God keep him meek and patient. Every day I grow madder after sending him to heaven. Hush, said Catherine, shutting the inner door. Don't vex me. Why have you disregarded my request? And Heathcliff says, what is it to you? He growled. So we've got, again, this idea of him being a black villain and also using the word growled, the verb growl, to describe the way that he talks. Just to kind of always acknowledge that Heathcliff very rarely, we get these glimpses sometimes when he talks to Nellie, but to Catherine he says on 112, you know, when they have this big confrontation, I know you have treated me infernally. And if I was telling my students to do close reading, obviously the repetition of that word infernally there, I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that, like hell, you treated me so poorly. Moving forward a bit, in the same edition on 114, this is actually Edgar Linton referring to Heathcliff, and says, I've been so far, I'm on 114 in this edition, I've been so far forbearing with you, sir, he said quietly, not that I was ignorant of your miserable, degraded character. And then if you go down, he says, your presence is a moral poison that would contaminate the most virtuous. And what's interesting is I had said previously how Catherine is used a lot with toxicity and infection, especially she goes to the Linton's house and Mr. and Mrs. Linton die. But here we've got degraded, poison, and contaminate that Edgar is using to describe Heathcliff. So again, just as though there are similarities between Hareton and Heathcliff, we'll see the similarities in terms of the word choice for Catherine and Heathcliff. So something to kind of track. There's also some great animal imagery here. There are some other moments where the Lintons are kind of referred to as like cats and, you know, or not like dogs. And here Heathcliff describes Edgar as a lamb, threatening like a bull. He even says it is in danger of splitting its skull against my knuckles. Really violent. But it was just really interesting how Heathcliff himself is using animal imagery now to describe Edgar and calls him a lamb, which is obviously an insult, meaning he's not very strong or this or that. And poor Edgar on the next page, on 115, Bronte writes, Mr. Edgar was taken with a nervous trembling, and his countenance grew deadly pale. For his life he could not avert that excess of emotion. So I think what's really interesting is that a lot of people will say how Heathcliff is this Byronic hero. He's that stereotypical like romantic character. But if you're talking about romantic with a capital R, I mean, Edgar here, Bronte writes, he has an excess of emotion, an overflow of emotion, so much so that he has to cover his face. So just note that. There's so much on 116. There's this idea that, Linton, despite his excess of emotion, he is strong enough to come back and face Heathcliff. He brings the gardeners and the coachman with him, but he does come back on 116. Nellie, again, we love her, we judge her, whatever we do, she does meddle. And she says, or the narrator says on 116, she did not know my share in contributing to the disturbance, and I was anxious to keep her in ignorance. She doesn't want Catherine, she definitely doesn't want Mr. Linton at times to know the ways that she has meddled, with allowing Heathcliff in or giving Heathcliff access. You'll see later, oh gosh, all the things she does with, the second Catherine. And I just want to point out that, Catherine says here, I shall get wild. It's towards the beginning of that large paragraph on 116. So there's a lot in terms of, and I asked my class actually even in our Zoom meeting earlier today, to just keep tracking how often this idea of an untamed wild nature is juxtaposed with something that is very controlled and very tamed and very domesticated. Catherine, I would say, is almost always with wild and savage. Edgar gives her an ultimatum. Thank you, Edgar, standing up for yourself on 117. And there's some really bizarre images associated with Catherine as she sort of, I would say, throws herself or causes herself to become so ill. On 118, there she lay, dashing her head against the arm of the sofa and grinding her teeth so that you might fancy she would crash them into splinters. Later, there's going to be, and when we get there, I'll show you the page where she's like literally ripping a pillow with her teeth. Hopefully it's reminding you of what? Of an animal, of a dog, literally like tearing apart a sofa, tearing apart a pillow. So again, if you're doing something where you're strictly comparing Catherine and Heathcliff, I think this description of her is definitely animalistic. It's so funny, I literally wrote in my book, like hee hee ha ha, that Nellie thinks that she is the most sensible soul. At the beginning of chapter 12, she says that she's the one sensible soul in the walls of the Grange. It lies within her, so she thinks that she's totally sane and doing a great job. Catherine, oh gosh, Catherine. If you really want to know how Catherine feels about herself on the bottom of 120, she literally, after all this, after everything that she's put everything through, she says to Nellie, I begin to fancy you don't like me. How strange. I thought, though everybody hated and despised each other, they could not avoid loving me. So loves to be that drama queen, that center of attention, and believes that no matter what she does, everyone should just keep going on loving her. Oh, Catherine. That image of her tearing the pillow, that's on 121, that beginning of that long paragraph. And something that's just kind of interesting that comes up in this chapter and comes up later and has come up, let's say, multiple times, is that the doctor's advice for Kathy is to not vex her. Don't bug her, let her be, don't give her any more stress. And this is kind of interesting how it's almost, they're acknowledging that what's going on with her is a little bit more than physical. So maybe something we'll talk about more when we study Freud in terms of her, quote, hysteria or whatever you want to call it. That's probably a word we'd use with psychoanalysis. Oh, my cat is jumping up on... Zelda, don't knock over my phone. There she goes. So just, again, interesting that the doctor says, don't vex her. And, of course, she did shake it a little bit. Let me fix that. Okay. Okay, so 123, and I'm thinking of my student. I always come back to you, the one who's interested in ghosts, who know who you are. Maybe there are more of you that I don't know. I know I am interested in ghosts. On 123, 124, 125, all these coming pages, I have written in my margins, ghost wish. And what I mean by that is I feel like everything Catherine says in those pages, says on those pages, really comes back or reminds me of that very first moment when Lockwood thinks that he sees a ghost. And it confirms for me that if Catherine, towards the end of her life, if she's having these dying desires and these dying wishes, maybe that's why her soul gets stuck. So on 123, she says, oh, if I were but in my own bed in the old house, she wishes for that, to be back home in the bed. It's where the ghost visits Lockwood. She says a reference to the oak paneled bed at home comes up again on 124. Says that she has, an aching in her, her heart aches for it. She is thinking so much in this time of when she was a child. She even says the last 7 years of my life have been I've drawn blank. And on 125, she says, "Oh, I'm burning. I wish I were out of doors. I wish I were a girl again, half savage and hardy and free and laughing at injuries not maddening under them. Why am I so changed? Why does my blood rush?" Go down a little bit more. "I'm sure I should be myself were I once among the heather on those hills." Open the window wide, fasten it open. Why don't you? She wants to be a girl again. That is the form that her, quote, ghost appears, and all these other desires. Even on the bottom of 125, she literally says, "They may bury me 12 feet deep and throw the church down over me, but I won't rest till you are with me. I never will." And obviously that's probably a reference to Heathcliff. It is also interesting talking about the world of the Lintons, maybe representing not just the aristocracy, but also just things that are very controlled and ordered. On 127, she even says, "Don't bury me among the Lintons, not in the chapel, but in the open air with a headstone." And that's 127. So again, even her desire for her dead body is to be outdoors, to be free, to not be confined inside some kind of, she even says under the chapel roof, but even like in the chapel grounds, like she wants to be buried in the middle of a hill, out in the open. So we've been talking a lot about Heathcliff in my class. I think even today they were talking about, do I think he could really murder someone? And another student made some great references to how, this idea of like the treatment of animals. Well, on 128, Miss Isabella's Springer, meaning her Springer Spaniel, her dog, Fanny, was suspended by a handkerchief and nearly at its last gasp. Nellie says, "I quickly released the animal and lifted it into the garden," and we find out later that it was Heathcliff who had done that, who had hanged Isabella's dog. So make of that what you will, but it's interesting, first of all, that it is a dog, but also the idea that he does indeed harm animals. He doesn't he's literally hanging them from trees. So something to just kind of note if you're tracking this idea of Heathcliff and what he's able to do. I think what's kind of interesting is that Edgar, I'm revealing my bias. I'm rooting for Edgar. I love Edgar as a character. I definitely love him as a father, which we'll talk about more later. But on 132, when he realizes that his sister has, betrayed him and ran off with Heathcliff and married Heathcliff, he's just so calm about it. And at the very end of chapter 12, "She went of her own accord," answered the master. "She had a right to go if she pleased. Trouble me no more about her. Hereafter, she is only my sister in name, not because I disown her, but because she has disowned me." It's very sad, but at the same time, he doesn't fly off the handle. He's pretty chill about it, and so I also like that very much about Edgar. So on 134, so we're about 2 pages into this chapter, there is the mention that Catherine is pregnant, and if you don't read closely, you might miss it. So on 134, the end of that long paragraph, "There was double cause to desire it, for on her existence depended that of another," meaning a child. "We cherish the hope that in a little while Mr. Linton's heart would be gladdened and his land secured from a stranger's by the birth of an heir." So this is, and again, another one of my brilliant students, really drew our attention here, or reminded us of the fact that what's so at stake here is the idea that, gosh, if Catherine if Catherine and Edgar, if this child was just a boy, everything would be solved, There would be a male heir to the home. Edgar wouldn't have to worry. Obviously, now that his sister has married Heathcliff, this is bringing in a really dangerous, male figure into their life. And so, again, we're worried about Catherine because, first of all, why is she starving herself and doing all these terrible things if she's pregnant? Someone asked, would she know? And I said, well, yes, if Nellie knew, she would know. But it's also just, hope. Maybe she'll have a boy, but of course she doesn't. It's like a perfect storm. Let's see. Again, if you're tracking anything on Heathcliff, not as a man, on 135 in the letter from Isabella, she writes, is Mr. Heathcliff a man? If so, is he mad? And if not, is he a devil? And so there's that devil word again. And what's interesting is before she reads this letter, Nellie says that she's held onto it all this long time because it is a relic of the dead. Any relic of the dead is precious. And so this is all obviously letting us know that Isabella is also not going, she's not alive by the time that Lockwood arrives. Okay, going forward, this letter, so the letter is just filled with just how terrible Heathcliff sort of treats her now that he has what, he wants from her, which is just to be married to her and maybe ruin her brother's life and maybe get her land eventually. But as one of my other students pointed out, and I just don't want to name you by names in case this YouTube lives on for who knows what, how long. But this idea of isolation and how lonely it is to be in the world of this book. And I would challenge, to maybe make the connection of how this book also presents marriage, perhaps. Because as soon as she marries Heathcliff, she's lonely. And this whole chapter is just about how awful the experience is when she ends up back at Wuthering Heights. The one comfort she gets, interestingly enough, is from a dog that was related to a dog that had belonged to her family and her father. And on 143, I just love this little moment. I fancy it knew me, meaning the dog. It pushed its nose against mine by way of salute. And so she literally touches noses with the dog, and that's the only comfort and connection that she feels. She says to Heathcliff, she talks about our room and uses the word our, and in our text it's italicized. I hope it is for whatever text you're using too. And the adjective our gave mortal offense. Heathcliff swore it was not, nor ever should be mine, and she says, I'm not even going to repeat the language that he uses. But Heathcliff reminds her, oh no, this is a patriarchal world, it is mine, you are beneath me now that we're married. And so just another thing, even the word our, oh my gosh, Isabella, what were you thinking? No, it's his. Okay, coming into the last chapter that we're going to talk about today, on the bottom of 147, my gosh, talk about a non-human image of Heathcliff. In the course that I teach, where I also teach Wuthering Heights, we started, literally the first work we talked about that was read over the summer was Dracula. And so I'm sure that my students are maybe made a connection here. On the bottom of 147, and he's talking about how he would never hurt Edgar if Catherine didn't want him to. So he says, I never would have raised a hand against him. You may look incredulous if you please. I never would have banished him from her society as long as she desired his. The moment her regard ceased, I would have torn his heart out and drunk his blood. So talk about non-human. My gosh, this is beyond even being compared to a dog. This is like a vampire. He says he's going to drink poor Edgar's blood. Poor Edgar. And he also says about Edgar, if you turn the page on 148, he's convinced that for every thought she spends on Linton, she spends 1,000 on me, and says that, Edgar is so puny that he couldn't love as much in 80 years as I could in a day. And this definitely reminds me of romantic, with a capital R in terms of that spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. My gosh, I love more in a day than Edgar could in 80 years. So, just interesting passage. Now, forgive me, if you've got younger siblings in the room, you're going to have to kick them out for just a moment, because the language on the top of 149 is not for little ones, but it is Bronte's words, and I think it's really important, especially when we start talking about, feminist readings of the text. So again, little ones, step away for a moment. On the top of 149, Heathcliff, now he's talking about Isabella, says, she degenerates into a mere slut. She is tired of trying to please me uncommonly early. So, wow, talk about close reading, to use that word to describe her, and then to immediately say it's because she's done pleasing me. I think that's just a passage that's sort of rich for analysis in terms of what Heathcliff thinks about women, or what he thinks about the Lintons, definitely what he thinks about even his own wife. So a moment to kind of just look a little closer to Mark that we can discuss in terms of Heathcliff's language for Isabella. And again on 150, you find out where he admits, that how he hanged the dog. And on the bottom of 150 is the word monster again. Let's see, where do I want to go? Just Just interesting, on 151, he says that he will haunt the Grange on the bottom of 151. Last night I was in the Grange garden 6 hours. I'll return there tonight, and every night I'll haunt the place, and every day till I find the opportunity of entering. And he uses this as a way to kind of manipulate Nellie, but it's just interesting that the verb there is haunt. Now, the very last thing I want to point out that is like, whoa, where did that come from? And it also shows you what kind of an impression the Mrs. Heathcliff that Lockwood met at the beginning of the book made on him. Because on 153, you know, when the narration breaks away from Nellie and comes back to Lockwood, says, "Let me beware of the fascination that lurks in Catherine Heathcliff's brilliant eyes. I should be in a curious taking if I surrendered my heart to that young person." And the daughter turned out a second edition of the mother. It's like our first glimpse, and this is going to come up later, so if you missed it, it's something minor that is important to note, and that is that Lockwood already has some kind of desire for the child, for the daughter of Edgar and Catherine that he met earlier. So keep your eye on that. Okay, so that's where we're going to end today. It's 153 in our edition. It's at the end of chapter 14, and thank you so much for watching.